Somewhere beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, resting in waters so deep that sunlight never reaches them, lie the remains of numerous American naval vessels, some lost in combat, others deliberately sunk during post-war disposal programs, target exercises, and weapons testing. Destroyers, cruisers, landing craft, supply ships, vessels that fought some of the most brutal naval engagements in human history. Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, the island-hopping campaigns that ground the Japanese Empire down to nothing. There was no single operation responsible for what happened to these ships. Instead, a patchwork of scrapping programs, reserve fleet policies, transfers to allies, target exercises, and scuttling operations gradually reduced the wartime navy, quietly, efficiently, and with almost no public attention. And for decades, the full story of what the United States did with its wartime fleet in the years after 1945 remained largely untold, as surely as those ships rested on the ocean floor. This is that story. To understand what happened in the aftermath of World War II, you have to first understand the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of what the United States built to fight it. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the U.S. Navy had roughly 790 vessels in active service. By the time the Japanese surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, that number had exploded to over 6,700 ships of all types. In less than 4 years, American shipyards had performed what many historians still call the greatest industrial miracle in the history of warfare. Shipyards from Quincy, Massachusetts to Richmond, California ran around the clock, 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. Women who had never set foot inside a factory learned to weld steel plate. Men too old for combat swung rivet hammers in the summer heat. In some yards, a new destroyer escort, a ship nearly 300 feet long, was being launched every single week. The numbers are almost impossible to process. Thousands of landing craft, hundreds of destroyers, dozens of aircraft carriers, cruisers, and battleships. The United States had built the largest navy the world had ever seen, and it had done so in roughly 1,400 days. And then, almost overnight, the war was over. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Japan surrendered, and the United States was suddenly left holding a naval inventory of staggering proportions with no enemy left to fight. What do you do with 6,000 warships when the war ends? The question sounds almost absurd, but it was absolutely real, and the men tasked with answering it faced pressures coming from every direction at once. The American public wanted their sons and husbands home. Congress wanted the military budget slashed. The economy was transitioning back to peacetime production, and every month those ships sat idle. They cost money, in maintenance crews, in fuel, in berthing fees at naval installations that were themselves being scaled back. The military brass had to make decisions quickly, and those decisions would shape what happened to the fleet in ways that the public would not fully understand for decades. Some ships had an obvious fate. The newest, most capable vessels, the Essex-class carriers, the fast battleships, the modern destroyers, were retained for what was now being called the Cold War fleet. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as America's new strategic rival, and the Navy needed to maintain a credible presence. So the best ships stayed. But even after you set those aside, you were still left with thousands of vessels in various states of wear, obsolescence, and wartime damage that ranged from cosmetic to severe. The first approach was transfer and disposal through official channels. Some ships were handed over to allied nations under the terms of various post-war agreements: Britain, France, the Netherlands, China, Greece. Destroyers that had escorted convoys through the North Atlantic found themselves flying foreign flags in the Mediterranean and the South China Sea. Landing craft that had put troops ashore at Normandy were repainted and handed to navies that needed coastal patrol capability. It was practical, and it moved ships off the American ledger. but the sheer volume of vessels meant this only went so far. Then came the scrapping programs. Thousands of ships were sold to commercial breakers, civilian companies that towed them to shallow water facilities and dismantled them for their steel. The metal was valuable. Post-war reconstruction efforts in the United States and abroad created a hungry market for raw material, and warships are, at their core, enormous quantities of high-grade steel. At scrapyards in New Jersey and along the California coast, workers with cutting torches worked for years, reducing proud warships to manageable chunks of metal that could be melted down and reused. But scrapping had its own limitations. Breaking a ship apart is labor-intensive, time-consuming, and requires facilities that were themselves being taxed to capacity. Not every ship could wait in line for a berth at a scrapping facility. Not every hull was in good enough condition to make the tow to one. And some ships, many ships, fell into a bureaucratic grey zone where the cost of keeping them, the cost of scrapping them, and the cost of giving them away all seemed to converge on a fourth option that the Navy had used throughout the war. You sink them. The deliberate sinking of surplus or damaged vessels, what the Navy calls scuttling, is as old as naval warfare itself. A ship you can't use and don't want the enemy to capture gets sent to the bottom. It's a grim but logical solution. And in the years after 1945, the United States Navy employed scuttling on an unusually large scale as one of several methods used to dispose of surplus vessels. The most well-documented of these operations unfolded in the summer and fall of 1946 in the remote waters of the Pacific. Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, brought a fleet of surplus warships to the middle of the ocean for a purpose that was, in its own way, as grimly practical as scuttling. The Navy wanted to understand what atomic weapons did to ships, so they gathered approximately 95 vessels, including captured Japanese and German ships, obsolete American battleships, destroyers, submarines, and support vessels, and used them as targets for 2 nuclear detonations. What came after the tests is less remembered than the explosions themselves. Many of the target ships survived the blasts, damaged, contaminated with radioactive fallout, but structurally intact. The question of what to do with them became urgent almost immediately. You couldn't simply tow radioactively contaminated warships back to U.S. ports. The technology to safely decontaminate them didn't fully exist. Some were studied intensively, others were scuttled in the deep waters around the test site, their disposition debated in naval circles and reported in the press at the time, though largely forgotten by the public in the decades since. But Bikini Atoll was just the most visible part of a much larger, much quieter disposal effort that was happening across the Pacific simultaneously. In the waters off Guam, Saipan, and the Philippines, the forward logistics bases that had sustained the drive toward Japan, thousands of smaller vessels were being disposed of by every means available. Landing craft by the hundreds were towed offshore and sunk. Yard craft, tugboats, barges, fuel lighters, repair ships, the vast supporting infrastructure of a Pacific campaign were disappearing beneath the waves at a rate that would astonish anyone who learned the full numbers today. Record-keeping varied widely. While many disposal actions were documented through Navy archives, ship disposal reports, and maritime commission records, others received only limited administrative attention and are difficult for historians to reconstruct today. In the chaos of post-war drawdown, with naval bases being closed, commands being dissolved, and personnel being mustered out as fast as they could be processed, the paperwork often didn't keep pace with the reality. Ships were sunk because there was nothing else to do with them, by men who were exhausted, overworked, and just trying to finish the job and get home. The men who carried out these scuttlings were, for the most part, ordinary sailors nearing the end of their service. Crews who had survived the Pacific War. Boatswain's mates and engineers who knew these ships intimately, who had kept them running through typhoons and combat and the grinding routine of wartime operations. And now they were opening seacocks, pulling detonator cords, stepping off the stern into waiting small boats and watching vessels they had served on slip beneath the surface. Several veterans later recalled the emotional experience of watching wartime ships deliberately sunk or dismantled after the war. The accounts share a common quality, a kind of muted grief that is difficult to articulate. These were not just machines. They were places where men had lived for years, where friendships had formed under pressure, where fear and boredom and the strange intimacy of a ship at sea had shaped lives that would never quite be the same on land. Watching them go under on a calm Pacific morning, intentionally, without ceremony, was something that stayed with men long after they went home. Not everyone was simply somber about it. The scale of the task had a numbing quality. When you are processing dozens of vessels through a single installation in a given month, individual ships stop being individuals. They become units, items on a list. The Navy was, above all else, trying to solve a logistical problem, and the men tasked with solving it had to operate that way to get through it. There were voices of dissent, even at the time. Some naval officers argued that the ships should be maintained in reserve, a strategic fleet that could be reactivated if another major war broke out. The argument was not unreasonable. The United States had entered both world wars with a fleet too small for the conflict it faced, and had scrambled desperately to build up. Why destroy a ready-made inventory? The answer came down to money and politics. Maintaining a reserve fleet costs real dollars: crews, dry docking, maintenance, spare parts. Congress was in no mood to fund a mothball navy on top of everything else the post-war budget demanded. And the emerging strategic doctrine, which centered increasingly on air power and the threat of atomic warfare, made mass surface fleets seem less relevant than they had even 5 years earlier. The admirals who wanted to keep the ships lost the argument, and the disposal programs continued. What makes the Pacific scuttling operations particularly striking, in retrospect, is the consistent preference for deep water. Ships were not sunk in the shallows where they might be recovered, inspected, or become navigational hazards. They were towed into water measured in thousands of feet and scuttled there. Most historians view this as a practical decision intended to avoid navigational hazards, reduce salvage concerns, and permanently dispose of surplus vessels, the sensible engineering choice when you need something gone for good. Because some of what went down with those ships has raised questions that took decades to surface. Wartime equipment, weapons, classified electronics, chemical warfare materials was aboard some of the vessels when they were scuttled. The United States and several other nations disposed of some chemical munitions at sea after the war, a practice that later became the subject of environmental concern and scientific study. Surveys conducted in the late 20th century found chemical agent canisters and artillery shells on the seafloor in multiple locations across the Pacific and Atlantic. It was not a covert program in any conspiratorial sense, but it was a chapter of post-war history that received almost no public discussion while it was happening. Today, some of those wrecks have been located by deep-sea survey teams. Sonar sweeps have found clusters of hulls resting on the seafloor in areas where the historical record indicates disposal operations took place. A few have been photographed by remotely operated vehicles, dark shapes in the silt, their wartime markings still faintly visible, coral beginning the slow work of colonizing steel that was built to last decades, but has now been down for 80 years. They lie there still. Among the vessels disposed of after the war were ships that had served throughout the Pacific Campaign, from the early carrier battles to the final assaults on Japan's island defenses. They were sent down quietly, efficiently, and in most cases with almost no public ceremony, in the unglamorous final chapter of the greatest naval conflict in history. Whether they deserved preservation or practical disposal remains a matter of perspective. But their final fate is one of the least remembered chapters of America's wartime naval story. These ships were built by American hands, crewed by American sons, and they helped save a world that might otherwise have been lost. That they rest now in the deep Pacific, known to archivists and sonar charts but largely absent from public memory, is perhaps the last and truest measure of how completely a nation can move on from what it once asked everything to accomplish. History, though, has a long memory, and the ocean keeps its secrets patiently until someone cares enough to go looking. If this kind of forgotten history matters to you, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, and this channel is committed to telling them with the seriousness they deserve.